Hello and welcome everyone to the webinar on critical factors for post-disaster educational continuity in urban floods in South and Southeast Asia. My name's Kate McFarlane and I'm a research advisor with the Education Safe from Disasters team at the Asia Regional Office. Before we begin, I have a bit of housekeeping. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box. You can use this box to post your reactions, engage with the content, and ask questions as we move through the presentation. We'll also be sharing other people's questions, and if you like other people's questions, I encourage you to hit the little love heart as well to vote for them, because we'll be selecting the top questions to ask our researchers here today. But before we begin, can I ask you to share your name, your organisation and the country you're joining from, and also your email in the comments box. And this is so we have an understanding of who's joined and can keep you in the loop for any future webinars as well as send out the research products when they're published. We'll also be having some questions at the end of the webinar, just a little evaluation to find out how we can improve these webinars, because we've got a series of 6 webinars coming up and we want to make sure that they're meeting your needs. If you have trouble with the connection, try logging in and out. We've found that that often helps. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and that's so we can share it with people who weren't able to make it today. We will be sharing it on Workplace for Save the Children participants, and we'll be sharing a link around for everyone else. Before I hand over to our researcher today, I wanted to give you a bit of context on the research program. So in 2016, there was a scoping study looking at the gaps in child-centred disaster risk reduction and comprehensive school safety evidence and guidance. And from that, there were 3 main themes where the gaps existed. And that was in policy, advocacy, and the enabling environment, the impacts of hazards on education, and solutions for child-centred DR and comprehensive school safety. In partnership with the CNA Foundation and CNA, as Save the Children commissioned many researchers to help us start to address these gaps. The partnerships has 10 projects across these 3 themes, and we'll continue to run the webinars covering off on the other projects. The research we're looking at today falls under theme 2, the impacts of hazards on education. And why is this topic important? Well, Asia Pacific is the most disaster-prone region in the world, and according to the World Disasters Report 2014, floods accounted for 44% of deaths caused by natural hazards worldwide. And that's more than any other natural hazard. The most affected region was Asia, and the scale and frequency of floods have had a significant impact on the education sector, particularly in urban settings. And keeping in mind the continual urbanisation and the rapid growth within Asia. The purpose of this research is to learn from prior research and practices and on how to plan and promote educational continuity in the face of hazards and disaster impacts. This research compared flood events in Vietnam, Thailand and Bangladesh to learn how education is disrupted and impacted by flood events, to look at the enablers and the blockers, and to also look at best practices to minimise disruption and promote educational continuity. To do this, we commissioned the University of Newcastle in Australia, who partnered with the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand, Dhaka University in Bangladesh, and the National University of Civil Engineering in Vietnam. We are very lucky to have Dr. Jason von Meeting from University of Newcastle here to present today, and we're also lucky to have his colleagues from the partner organisations here as well. We've got Dr. Indrajit Pal, Professor Humayun Kabir, Namhai Dao, Dr. Amanda Howard, and Dr. Ifted Ahmed, who will be contributing through the Q&A today. And I'd just like to extend a thank you for you all for joining. And at this point, I'll hand over to Jason. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks very much, Kate. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Can you just give me a thumbs up to make sure? Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar, where I'm really looking forward to share some of the key findings from our research project. Thank you so much to Save the Children, CNA Foundation, and CNA for sponsoring this research into a very important topic. And thank you for the opportunity to present to Save the Children staff around the world. Thank you all for being here. So today, in the next 20 to 30 minutes, I want to go through an introduction into the project, what our sort of point of departure was and the context of the research, to introduce to you what we're actually looking to investigate, the research questions and so on, to share with you how we designed the research and a bit about our methods, to introduce some of the findings in each country, but also the cross-cutting findings across the research, and then to share with you some of the recommendations that we have put forward in our full report, which I hope that you will all be interested in looking at in due course. So as Kate said, our research team was composed of academics, researchers from 4 universities. At the University of Newcastle, the team consisted of myself, Dr. Ifted Ahmed, Associate Professor Amanda Howard, who is now at University of Sydney, and Dr. Giuseppe Farina, who is now working back in Italy at T6 Ecosystems. Our partner in Thailand was Dr. Indrajit Pal at the Asian Institute of Technology. In Bangladesh, our partner was Professor Humayun Kabir at Dhaka University, and in Vietnam, our partner was Namhai Dao at National University of Civil Engineering in Hanoi. And so in this presentation, I'll be talking about findings from 3 different locations where we collected data with school stakeholders. First of all, in Bangladesh, we worked in Dhaka. In Vietnam, we worked in Dang Hoi in central Vietnam, and in Thailand, we worked in Bangkok. So I want to start off by just giving you a bit of context about the research to explain sort of how we positioned ourselves to look at this topic, and what we were, and sort of the terms of reference for the research. So I'll look at background, purpose, and research questions. So our starting points really for this research were, first of all, children and youth are vulnerable around the world to hazards, and they're a particularly vulnerable group, which Save the Children, of course, and but communities themselves endeavor to protect children and young people. Also, we recognize that education is disrupted due to urban flooding. We have evidence of this from many different contexts, and Save the Children has demonstrated a lasting interest in this phenomenon of disruption of education. Thirdly, we set off recognizing that flooding has impacts on education in a variety of ways. So it's not only in terms of days lost, it's not only in terms of physical damage, but there's other ways in which children and youth and the wider school communities are impacted by flooding. We came to this research with an appreciation of global frameworks, and our findings are positioned in light of, for example, HFA, the Sendai framework, the SDGs, and the work that Save the Children has been doing in promulgating the CSS framework around the world. And so our attitude was that education safe from disasters is a critical component within the global community, and that's how we have positioned our findings. In addition, we believe that South and Southeast Asia, while already particularly impacted by hazards, and particularly by floods, is likely to see increases in urban flooding impacts in the future. And this is underpinned by issues such as climate change, sea level rise, urbanization. You will have heard it said that this is the century of the city, and a lot of that growth in urban areas will happen in Asia. And finally, we, as a research team, recognize that schools are the educational and social centers of communities. So in this context of the wider society was really important to our study, and to see schools not only as in terms of their education potential for children, but in the wider context of community issues, and particularly in terms of the inequitable access to resources across communities and contexts. So that was something that was really of interest to us in undertaking this study. So these are the research aims that we set out within this work, to provide a comprehensive analysis of education disruption in urban floods and related hazards, to design a relevant basis for further regional research, to compile cross-cutting evidence about the impact of urban floods, and to produce practical recommendations for policy, operational measures, and monitoring and evaluation. We also started off with these 5 research questions, which I might just let you read through very quickly, and because I want to get into the guts of the findings, which will be really interesting, I think, to discuss. Okay, so we set out the context of what we wanted to investigate, and we started to design our project in order to achieve those aims and in order to answer the research questions that we began with. So I want to explain why we chose these case studies, how we selected our schools, and some of the methods that we used to actually collect the data and analyze the findings. So in terms of our case studies, we were commissioned to look across multiple countries and to look at cities of different scales. So what we used was theoretical replication to select our case studies. Theoretical replication is different than literal replication, and the difference really is that literal replication would be where you expect cases to exactly corroborate each other, and we wanted to select cities that were actually very different, because of course you'll all recognize that every flood is different and every disaster is different. So the theoretical replication meant that we understood that there would be differences for very predictable reasons. For example, the political, social, and economic context of each city and country. So our case study in Bangladesh, we selected Dhaka, and some of the reasons why we selected Dhaka were that really it's indicative of urban development in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is predicted to be 50% urbanized by 2050. Dhaka is also a city with infrastructure under pressure and a population of over 14 million. And it experiences different types of flooding as well. So annually it will experience monsoon flooding, but around every 10 years for the past 50 years, there's been major riverine floods, which have caused extensive impact. Our second case study was in Dong Hoi in Vietnam. Dong Hoi is a city in north-central coastal Vietnam. It has a much lower population than Dhaka. It's 160,000, but it's rapidly urbanizing. And it's this rapid urbanization is bringing new risks that the city needs to cope with. Dong Hoi experiences regular damage to schools, and it was the one case study where we talked to a lot of school stakeholders who had experienced death of students as well due to flood disasters in Dong Hoi. Our third case study in Bangkok was in Bangkok in Thailand. Bangkok is the capital of Thailand and the economic center, and has a population of over 8 million. It's very low-lying, and there's quite a bit of good research about the flooding in 2011. There are 500,000 students affected there, and that was something that was fresh in the mind of many of the participants in our study, was the 2011 event. So in each of the countries that we worked in, we selected 3 government-run schools with similar access to resources. And we selected these schools based on convenient sampling with inclusion and exclusion criteria. So some of the criteria for the selection of schools were based on location, their experience of urban flooding, and the level of study. So as you can see in slide 12, we selected 1 school at each of the 3 levels, primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary, in each country to collect data within. In terms of some of the methods that we used in our study, we conducted 104 interviews in total across the 3 countries. These were semi-structured interviews conducted by local researchers in the local language. So in each country we collected 30 interviews within the schools themselves, and we interviewed 4 to 5 key policy informants about the wider policy context in that country. We used purposive sampling to select interviewees. That's basically selection based on the characteristics of the population and the objectives of the study. And we set out inclusion and exclusion factors for selection of these participants. The second main mode of data collection was through focus groups. And over the 3 countries, we conducted 54 focus groups. And within each of the schools, we selected 3 groups of participants, which were teachers, parents, and students. And we conducted 2 focus groups for each of those groups in each school. And these were conducted again by local researchers in the local language. And overall, the normal participation was about 7 to 8 participants in those focus groups. So when we collected this data from the interviews and focus groups, we translated back into English, and we set about analyzing the data. And we used data source triangulation which refers to the application and combination of several research methods to study the same phenomenon. So we basically did this to validate the data. We used then a thematic analysis, and we read and reread transcripts to start to allow themes to emerge from the data. Another thing that we did was collect secondary quantitative data from the schools to support some of the emerging findings with greater context of what was happening in each school. So I want to first of all talk about some of the specific observations from each country, and then I'll move on to the cross-cutting factors. So if we look first of all at Bangladesh, our research found that there was quite widespread impact of floods on schools, and in the period 1971 to 2007, over 120,000 schools were impacted by floods. What we found, especially in interviewing key policy informants, was that there appeared to be a lack of integration of policies at multiple levels, so between levels of government. In addition, within the education sector, we found that not everyone saw school safety as the top priority in the sector. And then when we went to the school level, we found that there was actually autonomous DRR initiatives that were occurring and being organized by some of those local stakeholders. We also found that schools in Bangladesh were often used as shelters, and this has a variety of impacts. And we found that school closure tended to vary depending on the infrastructure of the school itself. So we found that some schools were able to prevent closure quite well because they had superior infrastructure, and other schools experienced shutdowns due to flooding. And one of the things that we've done, and you'll see in our final report, is try to put in a lot of quotes from our interviews from the teachers, parents, and students. A quote from a parent in Bangladesh: "Mosquitoes and flies become abundant due to waterlogged areas after floods. This also impacts on health and environment, as children are often caught by different diseases like fever." And you'll see that that's something that comes out in some of the cross-cutting findings. Secondly, then, in Vietnam, some of the key things that we found. You may have been aware that Vietnam experienced quite a turbulent 2017. Typhoon Doksuri, for example, affected 635 schools in Vietnam, and there was a series of storms and floods that affected the region that we were studying. We found in Vietnam that there was actually quite a high standard of policy integration across multiple levels, and that the different levels of government had actually implemented quite effective early warning systems within communities. And we found quite positive reports about communication between government, schools, and parents. We found that schools in Vietnam have disaster risk management boards, and they also have school preparedness plans and community action plans. But what we also find was that the level of inequity of access to resources and inequality and poverty led to some students and families being particularly vulnerable to the impacts of floods. So in Vietnam, we also saw, or we also heard about students that were killed in recent urban floods. A student from Dong My Primary in Vietnam said about half my class came to school, the rest were absent because some of them had family issues. Others couldn't go to class because there was still floodwater in their homes. So just emphasizing that the inequities that we see within all of these societies were manifesting in different types of impacts on students and their families. Finally, in Thailand, some of our key findings were that schools were quite often damaged by flood events. In 2011, we heard about, from our participating schools, some of the widespread impacts. 3,000 schools were damaged in 2011. We found in Thailand quite a high level of integration of policy across government levels, as well as standardized procedures for various aspects of disaster management that were widely implemented. What some of our participants reported was that there was a lack of training for school stakeholders, and they reported that they would have liked to see much more of this in schools in Thailand. Again, we saw widespread use of school as shelters in Thailand, and a lot of school days being lost when flooding was quite severe. A teacher in Thailand, in Phak Khai, commented, "I think we need to have proper action and preparedness plans. The school does not have any specific training course for teachers, students, and staff, such as a preparedness or response plan." Okay, so I want to move on to discuss some of the cross-cutting findings from the study. And the way that we have categorized these for the presentation and in our report are to look first at impacts of urban flooding on schools in this region. Secondly, to look at capacities, which can be mobilized and utilized to help school communities to better cope and better prepare and respond. And then finally, what kind of factors we identified as enabling and blocking educational continuity in terms of policy and operational issues. So first of all, looking at the impacts of urban flooding on schools, we, as I said previously, we wanted to emphasize that the impacts of urban floods extend beyond damage to facilities. And this is something that really cut across the three countries. And so we categorize these impacts as infrastructural, pedagogical, and psychosocial. So some of the infrastructural factors which we identified across the case studies were damage to buildings, which were indicative of waterlogging, building failures, lost materials, and so on. Solid waste management was a common issue. We found lack of adequate disposal, lack of management or lack of maintenance of some of the systems, and limited training and knowledge about waste management. We also found that the school location was often not ideal and showed a lack of awareness of flood risk, insufficient planning regulations, and perhaps just inability to procure the right locations for such an important facility. We also found that drainage systems were commonly reported as a key issue due to poor design, poor maintenance, and a lack of sensitivity to the ecosystem. And we found also that there was a lot of transport impacts that kept coming up in each country related to urban flooding due to disruption in the transport system, lack of communication or breakdown of communication between schools and parents and students, sometimes a risk of injuries in transit, loss of power, and these kinds of issues. In terms of pedagogical impacts, we found that one of the key things that was reported in the case studies was that there is sometimes a lack of information and a lack of timely information and accurate information being disseminated between the school stakeholders, in that the students and families didn't always receive an accurate update of what was going on. Sometimes we found that families without technology were excluded from the dissemination of information. And in cases where this happened, the uninformed students were more likely to be at risk due to maybe attempting movement between locations where it would have been safer to remain in place. Secondly, then, in terms of pedagogic impacts, we found that learning was interrupted, and this is something that, of course, is front and center in terms of educational continuity, finding out ways in which to continue learning. And some of the impacts of the interruption of learning that were reported were lost productivity among students, loss of direction and concentration, losing that access to appropriate guidance, and the development of a knowledge gap, sometimes among students without access, as opposed to students who could maintain access to learning. Next, in terms of scheduling, we found that a lot of students reported uncertainty in progress in terms of curriculum when they were trying to study for exams and trying to access additional classes. Sometimes some students in some schools were able to enroll in additional classes or to get tutors, and that put other students at a disadvantage. What we did find in some locations is that exam schedules were put back intentionally to allow students and schools time to catch up in terms of their curriculum. And finally, in the pedagogical impacts, we saw change of use of facility emerging, where schools were used as shelters, which was, in a lot of cases, quite disruptive to the educational function of the school, but served a community purpose. So there's debate as to the pros and cons of schools as shelters, of course. And we also find that communities or that students found disruption of classes due to this a big negative. So finally then, our third category of impact, psychosocial, we found the following factors emerge. First of all, basic needs of students. We're looking, some of the students and some of the families really experience difficulties in trying to access resources, and they find the reduction of access or destruction of their own resources very difficult to cope with. In addition, as you might imagine, there was health impacts on students and families, and this ranged from physical injuries and disease to contaminated food and water, and bites from animals and insects, and these kinds of issues. Our students in all three countries reported extreme pressure and additional pressure on them in terms of continuing their studies, because they were often dealing with extended issues in their families, such as a reduction of income, not being able to afford new books and clothes that might have been destroyed, sometimes losing friends or family members in urban floods, and dealing with the trauma of that. In addition, a lot of the school stakeholders were dealing with uncertain living conditions and changes to their everyday life. Some people were temporarily or permanently displaced, and there was a lot of uncertainty about their futures. We also saw that students and staff sometimes had additional responsibilities that were placed on them in terms of helping their families to recover from the urban floods. So they had a shift in priorities. So where they might have been able to concentrate on their studies before, they had other responsibilities that they needed to prioritize in the aftermath of an urban flood event. And finally, in terms of psychosocial impacts, we saw marginalization of certain groups in these. What we found in all three countries was that an important cross-cutting theme was that stakeholders need to draw on an existing individual and community capacities to prepare for and respond to urban flooding, and also to adapt for the future. And so one of our key things that we found in this study was that we need to recognize and utilize capacities in order for first responders to the issue to be best equipped. First responders, of course, in urban flooding are the community itself. So within the school, we found that things like adaptive solutions were widespread. Sometimes there was accommodation on site when it was unsafe to travel, stockpiling of resources, improvements to buildings, and maintaining drainage systems were important things in the school that could be enhanced and supported by practitioners. In terms of the wider community, we found that communities with strong ties and strong support for schools were the most resilient. Financial support was often seen within communities to help the community to prepare, help the community to recover. We saw a lot of volunteering within the community and a lot of willingness to volunteer to help to clean up and be involved in preparedness activities. A lot of psychosocial support that could be tapped into within the community as well. And then, bringing the adults in the community into the discussion in terms of providing care for the vulnerable children and youth was a really important capacity that can be drawn on. So in terms of establishing some of the factors that either help to enable duty bearers to maintain continuity or have the opposite effect and block this potential, we looked at policy factors and also operational factors that we saw as enablers and blockers. And in order to understand the policy better, we interviewed key policy informants, and we found things like fragmentation in policy, specific policy working in disaster management, community and coordination, explicit support for preparedness, and the conversation around schools as shelters to be some of the things that can help to provide an enabling policy framework, but the absence of these things can actually be a blocker to continuity. In terms of operationally, we looked at issues such as, or we found issues such as standard operating procedures, provision of first aid, external support, emergency and preparedness planning, and so on, to be some of the key issues that enabled educational continuity, but also some of the things that came up when we were talking about why educational continuity was not happening. So just finally looking through some of our recommendations, which you can in due course will be able to read in full in our final report. Although we didn't set out to frame the study around the CSS framework, what we found was that a lot of our evidence from the case studies and many of our recommendations actually aligned really well with the work that Save the Children were doing on CSS. So in our final report, we have framed our recommendations to align with CSS, which was really something we wanted to do. And these were not only around the 3 pillars of CSS, but we also found a lot of factors that we wanted to recommend in terms of providing an enabling environment and policy. So some of these, as you can see, align with CSS in terms of safer school facilities, raising the ground and adding levels, improving drainage and irrigation channels, safe storing of teaching and learning equipment, early warning, in terms of school disaster management, standard procedures for reunification, flexible calendar, adjustment in exam schedules and first aid boxes, and thirdly, risk reduction and resilience education. So disaster awareness, preparedness and behavior, and support to adaptive capacities. And then that enabling environment side, we wanted to emphasize the importance of the enabling environment to support CSS. So issues like communication and coordination, integrating DRR into the education sector's policies was key, and we saw some evidence of this in some of our case studies. The importance of practitioners and agencies to advocate for vulnerability reduction was critical, because a lot of the impacts that we found in our case studies were on children and families that had inequitable access to resources and were suffering from constructs of vulnerability in their community. And then in addition, stockpiling resources and improving buildings were also key. So one of the key things that we wanted to emphasize is that researchers, policymakers, and practitioners working on ensuring educational continuity after urban floods need to deeply engage with physical, institutional, and organizational context of schools, as well as with vulnerabilities and capacities that school stakeholders experience in everyday life. And so this idea of really paying close attention to the everyday lived experience of school stakeholders, I think is something that I'd like people to really think about and take away from this, and that we really need to really engage with the context of the schools and look at this through a lens of understanding vulnerability and capacities. Secondly, another key thing I wanted to emphasize is that diverse and nuanced research, policies, and practice can support efforts towards school education continuity in these countries, and that the research furthers knowledge about education continuity in the region. And I hope that we'll be able to push on from here with further research. The research has opened up a lot of other possibilities for looking at specific aspects in more detail, and I know that that is high on the agenda of Save the Children, and we really appreciate being part of this. And thirdly, practitioners are key to implementing these recommendations. So you all here listening to this and hopefully reading the report are really important on the front line of implementing these recommendations. And we look forward to seeing how Save the Children practitioners engage with school stakeholders. And we think that it's, and I'm sure you agree, it's important to listen, understand, and respect the needs and desires of school stakeholders themselves. And I will hand back over to Kate. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Jason, for your very informative presentation. Now it's over to you, everyone joining. The floor's open to ask questions, and I can see a couple have come through already, so I may just jump straight to them. Jason, when you're talking about the cross-cutting factors, and in particular the community, did you find that learnings from previous floods were being put into practice?
Yes, absolutely, Kate. I think that all of these communities have experienced floods, and it's part of why we selected them for the study. And we found that a lot of the participants in our interviews actually were very positive about their experience of coping with floods, and they said, yeah, well, it's just part of life, it's just what we do. So we found that that communities have a large repository of knowledge around floods, and they actually already have a lot of strategies, and they've adapted to cope with the local condition, and really I think we, as a research team, we want to emphasize that we need to listen to them in the first instance, and be very aware and respectful of their position as as the people who probably know the most about the local condition, and build that into our understanding of the context.
Thank you. And keeping in with the theme of communities, did they present themselves as being the first responders?
Well, I would say that there is quite a variety in terms of how the participants perceived their role in the response and in terms of responsibility. Some participants really maybe felt left down by those who they felt had a duty to respond or provide resources or provide help when they experienced an urban flood, whereas other communities were really had the opinion that they just cope with it and they didn't really expect too much help. But through all the countries, there were certain individuals who were really able to talk about the wider context and the policy framework and what could be improved in each country in terms of change right through the different levels of governance, right through to the management of schools. And I think a key thing coming forward was that school stakeholders in the local context really do want to be the frontline people. I think that was unanimous. But they don't always have the resources or the training to do that. So I think that's something that can be a focus of future efforts to prepare them and to harness their capacity to be those frontline responders.
Thank you. And we just have a question around what were you thinking when you recommend support to adaptive capacity of school stakeholders?
Adaptive capacity skills. So I think the recommendation is that, as I was saying, we need to understand that both individuals and schools and communities have those capacities, and they've built up that experience and knowledge, and that practitioners need to recognize when they see spontaneous initiatives emerging after a flood that we need to give value to those practices. We need to, whether they're formal or informal, that are undertaken by communities before, not only after a flood, but before, during, and after. And we need to be on the lookout for some of those initiatives in order to support them. That's really what we were thinking.
Great. Jason, it's very hard to keep up with all the questions that are coming through here, but I have a question from Kevin Ronan, and it may be a bit of a tricky question to just answer straight off here, so we've always got the option to answer it after over email. But if there were one action or capacity or one organised set of actions that could be taken by a local school to best prevent, mitigate, prepare, respond, what would that action or set of actions be?
Yeah, you're right. I should really write down a response to that. But I think number one, I would say understanding local and everyday vulnerability, and maybe mapping that out and seeing what the experience of stakeholders is in terms of their structural conditions of their society are, because really that's what underpins the impact of floods. Secondly, I think we need to really tap into the capacity of communities and of schools and of individuals and prioritize support for capacity building. in the local context. And I think part of that is to prioritize training and education of teachers and of students. And I think that's something that we saw as lacking in a lot of the schools that we studied, was that feeding down from the top level, from government, who are often trying to follow whether it's Sendai framework or it's CSS, they're trying to get that down to the school level so that students and teachers are actually participating in preparedness activities and disaster risk reduction activities.
Thanks, Jason. And it's a nice segue talking about hazards, vulnerabilities and capacities as under another of the research projects under this research program. We're looking at all the different tools out there to assess this and supporting practitioners to navigate all the tools and ask the right questions to be able to do exactly what you say, understand the vulnerabilities and the capacities of the community. The next question I have here is, are the strategies improving or just something we have always done? And go for it.
Yeah. Well, I would say that in most of the schools that we studied, there was definitely a feeling that schools were more prepared than they had been in the past, and that they were improving based on initiatives from the government in each country, in terms of the government improving their policies. You know, initiatives, we saw initiatives from government, but also from NGOs and other stakeholders trying to offer capacity building programs and training and so on in within schools. So I think across the 3 countries, we saw a lot of evidence that things had definitely improved.
And who were the stakeholders offering the capacity building?
Well, it was a range of government groups or NGOs or community-based organizations that were offering these trainings. Some of the schools, you know, indicated that they hadn't had any of this kind of opportunity to participate in trainings, and I think through our results we might be able to really show where that could be effective in reaching people that hadn't had any opportunity for that kind of training.
And we've got time for one last question. Did any of the respondents think about moving out of their hometown due to the high prone or the high risk of flooding in the area?
Yeah, I'd love to hand to some of the local researchers on that one, but my understanding was that in Vietnam in particular, we saw that a lot of, in Dong Hoi, because it's a city, it's not a very large city, so there was a lot of children that were going to school in Dong Hoi that were displaced back to rural areas. So there's a lot more disruption in terms of displacement in Vietnam as compared to the other 2 case studies. But we did find that a lot of students and families that experience severe damage to their homes or losing their homes completely were displaced to other cities or other districts to live with family or friends. So that was something that came through quite strongly.
Thanks, Jason. Well, that concludes the webinar on critical factors for post-disaster educational continuity in urban floods in South and Southeast Asia. First of all, I want to thank Jason for coming and presenting and answering all of our questions, and for all of your partners joining online as well. And thank you to everyone else for joining the webinar. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar and a PDF of the PowerPoint there. The report and summary for this project will be published next month, very shortly, on the GADRIS website, and you should be able to see in the top right hand corner of your screen, you can click straight through to the GADRIS website where it will be published. We have a number of webinars coming up on the different research topics, so I encourage you to keep an eye out and join if you can, or to look out for the recordings. But before we go, and to help us improve how we run these webinars, we've just got a couple of questions that we would like to ask you. And if you could reply in the comments box to these 3 questions. Just what did you like about the webinar? How would you improve the webinar? And how will you use the research in your practice? So you can comment now for those 3 questions, and we will post those questions up so you can see them as well. Thanks again, Jason, and thank you, everyone.
Very welcome, Kate. Thanks to everyone for attending. Glad to be here. If anyone has any other questions for me, you're welcome to email me personally to discuss our research. Thanks.